Hello, welcome to the channel. Subscribe, leave a like, and don't forget to write a comment. Enjoy watching.
When I asked my parents if they could help cover part of my therapy bills, my mom literally laughed and said, "You don't need therapy. You need to stop being so dramatic." The next morning, I woke up to a group chat notification. Surprise, Kelsey's going to Bali. So I quietly changed my emergency contact. And that's when things shifted. When I finally worked up the nerve to ask my parents for help, I had rehearsed the conversation in my head at least a dozen times, practicing every line like I was preparing for a job interview, down to my tone, my pacing, even the pauses I'd leave to sound calm, rational, not overly emotional. I told myself I had to make it easy for them to say yes, to understand why I needed this without thinking I was being needy or unstable or, God forbid, dramatic. I wasn't asking for a handout. I was working full-time and again, I had my own place. I was doing all the things adults are supposed to do, but therapy was the one thing keeping me from collapsing into that dark mental space I had clawed my way out of a couple years ago. And with rent, groceries, utilities, and everything else stacking up, I needed a little help, just for a few sessions. Just until I could get a bit more breathing room, that's all. So when I called my mom and carefully laid it all out, when I explained that therapy was working but I couldn't afford to keep it going weekly, and asked, not demanded, if they could help me cover a couple of sessions, the silence on the other end of the phone felt like it lasted an hour, even though it was probably no more than 3 seconds. Then came the laugh. That tight, sharp, dismissive laugh that wasn't amused. It was annoyed. My mom laughed like I had just asked if I could borrow the car to go to a party in high school again. Then she said, "Leah, you're not seriously still doing that therapy stuff, are you? Haven't you outgrown that phase? You're almost 40. Honestly, you need to stop being so overdramatic." Overdramatic, that word. I've been hearing it since I was maybe 11. Every time I tried to express that I wasn't okay. Every time I cried too long, got too quiet, got too tired. Overdramatic. That's what my feelings were to them. Not signals, not signs, not pain. Just a phase, a mood, something to get over, like a bad haircut or a pimple. And maybe the most insane part? My dad was on speaker. He was right there. And he didn't say anything. "No, come on, Donna, that's not fair. No, Leah, let's talk about it." Just a quiet grunt and then some noise in the background that I assumed was him turning up the volume on the TV. That was it. End of discussion. I thanked them anyway, I don't know why, force of habit maybe, and hung up. I sat on the edge of my bed, holding my phone like it might burn a hole through my fingers. I felt humiliated, not because I'd asked for help, but because they reminded me, yet again, that I don't get to ask. That needing something from them was a form of weakness they didn't know how to respond to. Or maybe they did, they just didn't care to. I didn't cry. I think that's important to say. I didn't fall apart or scream or throw anything. I sat there feeling all the disappointment solidify into something heavier, something colder, like a glacier pushing slowly across my chest. The next morning, around 7:30, my phone buzzed. Group chat message, family, the one my mom created years ago where she mostly just posted blurry pictures of the dog or recycled Facebook memes. I clicked it out of reflex. Big picture of Kelsey, grinning like a Disney princess in some travel agency photo op, holding a giant boarding pass cutout that said, "Bali bound," in glittery letters. The caption said, "Surprise for our sweet girl, Bali baby, she deserves it." I just stared at it. No words, no reaction. My sister was going to Bali. Bali. She hasn't worked in almost 8 months, but apparently what she deserved was an international getaway to clear her mind. Meanwhile, I had to choose between groceries and mental health. And here's the thing, this wasn't new. Not really. Kelsey had always been the golden girl, the soft one, the one who needed support and space and encouragement. When she flunked 2 classes in college, they blamed the professors. When she totaled my dad's truck during a joyride, they said it was because she'd been under a lot of stress. When she ghosted her last job by just not showing up one Monday, They actually helped her write an email saying she was taking time for personal growth. But when I told them I was struggling with anxiety and couldn't sleep through the night, I was being dramatic. When I said I didn't want to come to Christmas because the big gatherings overwhelmed me and left me spiraling for days, I was being selfish. When I finally admitted that I sometimes felt like I didn't exist when Kelsey was in the room, my mom told me, and I quote, "Well, maybe stop sulking and we'd notice you more." That morning, something inside me just clicked. No yelling, no tantrum, just a quiet shift, like something inside me finally gave up trying to be heard. I opened my phone settings, scrolled down to emergency contacts, and deleted Mom from the top of the list. I replaced her name with Claire, my friend from work, the one who actually came to check on me after my last panic attack, and brought soup and a weighted blanket because she said she read somewhere it might help. I didn't even tell Claire right away. It just felt necessary, like changing a lock after a break-in. You don't always wait to tell people why. You just do it. The thing about family is, when they hurt you in tiny, casual ways over and over again, you stop noticing when one of those tiny ways cuts deeper than the rest, until suddenly you're bleeding and you can't even remember what the first wound was. That's how it felt. I didn't answer the group chat. I didn't like the post. I didn't say congratulations. I muted the conversation, closed my laptop, and walked to my window. Outside, a garbage truck was crawling down the street, hydraulic arms lifting heavy bins and dumping them into its belly with mechanical groans. I watched it drive away for a long time, thinking how strange it is that something so loud can still feel so final. And I wondered, if I disappeared from their world tomorrow, would they even notice? Or would I just be another muted thread in a long, messy family chat, lost between glittery vacations and birthday cakes? I didn't answer that question, not then, but I was starting to think I'd find out sooner than later. When I was a kid, probably around 10 or 11, I remember standing in the hallway of our house, holding a crumpled drawing I'd made at school, a lopsided tree with purple leaves and a crooked sun in the corner, and waiting patiently, silently, for my mom to look up from whatever she was doing and tell me she liked it, or even just that she saw it. But she never did. She walked past me, brushing her hand lightly against my shoulder like I was furniture, murmuring something about Kelsey needing help with her science project, which, by the way, she'd already half finished for her the night before. That moment, me standing there clutching my little paper in silence, swallowing the lump in my throat and telling myself not to make a scene, is one of my earliest memories of feeling invisible. Not ignored exactly, not hated or abused, just not seen. And what I learned that day, and in 1,000 other quiet moments after it, was that in our family, attention wasn't earned through effort or honesty or need. It was given freely, generously to the one who shined the brightest, who needed the most, who cried the loudest. And it was never me. I used to think that maybe I was just too quiet, too inward, too much of a background character in the drama. That was my family's carefully staged production of togetherness and smiles. Kelsey, my younger sister by 6 years, had always had this magnetic pull about her. People gravitated toward her in that effortless way some people do, not because she was particularly kind or talented, or even charming in any traditional sense, but because she had this way of making her feelings the center of any room she entered. If she was happy, we all celebrated. If she was sad, the world paused until she felt better. If she was tired, we dimmed the lights and whispered. If I was tired, I should probably get more sleep. If I was sad, maybe try going for a walk or something, get some air, stop being such a downer. By the time I was in high school, I had learned that my role in the family wasn't to be nurtured or supported. It was to be steady, uncomplaining, and useful. I did my homework without being asked, helped make dinner, watched Kelsey after school, and sat through tense dinners where my parents tiptoed around her latest meltdown, like bomb technicians, while I quietly cleared the plates and rinsed them without being told. And the irony? I wasn't even the good one. I was the one who didn't need help, who could handle things, who never asked for anything, which in their eyes meant I didn't need anything at all. I kept it together for years. College was my one escape. I went out of state, got a scholarship, found a rhythm, but even then, the calls always started the same way. Have you heard from Kelsey? Can you check in on her? We're worried she's not returning our messages. Never. How are you doing, Leah? Or is there anything you need? It was always Kelsey at the center, and me somewhere orbiting quietly, expected to be the emotional translator, the one who understood, who managed, who fixed. There was one year, I think I was 27, when Kelsey dropped out of grad school 3 weeks before finals, citing burnout, and my parents threw her a brunch to celebrate her bravery. They posted pictures online, toasting champagne glasses in the backyard, while I sat at home, 3 hours away, recovering from a surgery they hadn't even asked about. I had driven myself to the hospital and back. I remember lying on the couch with a stitched-up stomach, watching the photos roll in on Facebook, my mom's caption reading, "So proud of our girl for choosing herself." And all I could think was, what would I have to do to be seen like that? Would I have to fall apart in public? Quit my job dramatically, cry in the driveway and refuse to leave the house? Because quietly surviving didn't seem to earn anything. So when people ask me now, even gently, why I don't just talk to them or let them know how I feel, I want to laugh. Not because it's funny, but because the sheer futility of that suggestion is exhausting. I've tried. I've tried so many times I could scream. I've had the calm conversations, the careful explanations, the hopeful, trembling moments where I spelled it all out, the anxiety, the depression, the nights when I thought maybe it would be better if I just disappeared. And each time, I watched their faces harden, or glaze over, or rearrange themselves into performative concern. For about 5 seconds before pivoting the conversation back to Kelsey's latest drama, or how hard things were for them. And yet, I kept showing up. For holidays, for birthdays, for those long, awkward dinners where I'd help wash dishes while Kelsey posted selfies from the table, and my mom gave me a tight smile and said, "You should smile more, Leah. You look so serious all the time." I kept sending gifts on time. I kept replying to texts. I kept playing the role because it felt safer than disappearing altogether, and because some part of me, deep down, still hoped they might eventually notice me without me having to fall apart to get their attention. But the moment I changed my emergency contact, that part of me, the part that kept hoping, died. And what replaced it wasn't rage or bitterness, though I could have justified both. What replaced it was something quieter and more dangerous. A kind of clarity, a cold recognition that I'd been playing a game that only worked if I never asked for anything real. That I had been performing emotional labor for a family that couldn't be bothered to check if I was bleeding. And maybe, just maybe, it was time I stopped auditioning for love that had to be earned by being less of a burden. Have you ever reached a point where the silence from people who claim to love you feels louder than any scream? Where you sit across from someone you've known your entire life and realize they don't know a damn thing about you, not your fears, not your dreams, not even your favorite song? That's where I was. That's where I had been, for longer than I wanted to admit. And something in me had finally, irrevocably shifted. They hadn't noticed yet. They wouldn't, not right away, but that was the point. They weren't supposed to, not until it was too late, not until the line went dead, and they realized no one was on the other end anymore. Not until they reached for me in the dark and found that I had already let go. There is a strange sort of peace that comes with deciding you are no longer going to fight for something that never really wanted you in the first place. Not a loud, triumphant peace, not the kind that feels like fireworks or applause, but a quiet, humming kind, like the moment when the air conditioner finally kicks off after running too long, and you realize how long you've been listening to the noise without even noticing it. That was what it felt like in the days after I removed my mother from my emergency contacts. Not a grand rebellion, not a bold declaration of independence, but a gentle severing of something that had been strangling me for far too long. A fraying cord that I finally stopped pretending to braid back together. I didn't make any announcements, no Facebook statuses or family group messages, declaring a new era of boundaries and self-care. I knew better than that. If I had said it aloud, if I had tried to explain once again that I needed space, that I was suffocating under the weight of years of emotional negligence disguised as normalcy, they would have dismissed it, turned it into another performance of concern that lasted just long enough to check the box of pretending they cared, before going back to their regular programming of birthday posts and dog pictures and overly sweet captions about family being everything. So instead, I went quiet. Not cold, not cruel, just quiet. The first thing I did was block the family group chat, not because I was angry, but because I knew I would keep checking it otherwise, hoping for a moment of inclusion, a message that said they noticed I hadn't replied, a photo that actually acknowledged my absence instead of simply ignoring it, like I never existed in the first place. Blocking it was like closing the blinds in a room that had too much light. It wasn't darkness I wanted, just control over what came in and when. Then I changed my settings so their calls went straight to voicemail, not because I wanted to avoid them entirely, but because I needed to stop flinching every time their names lit up my screen. I had spent too many years feeling that familiar spike of anxiety. Whenever my phone rang, my mind immediately jumping to worst-case scenarios, only to find out it was a reminder about Kelsey's birthday dinner or a forwarded video of a baby laughing. I began to shift the infrastructure of my life in ways that seemed minor but felt monumental, replacing old photos on the wall with new ones that reflected the life I was trying to build for myself, one that wasn't tethered to their expectations or silence. Updating my healthcare forms so that Claire, my friend and confidant, would be the one called if anything went wrong. Rerouting my mail from the family home to my apartment permanently, even though my mother still occasionally sent cards or unsolicited packages I never asked for. I wasn't trying to punish them. I was trying to protect myself from the slow erosion of self-worth that came every time I was reminded of how little space I occupied in their world. My therapist, Maya, noticed the difference before I said anything. She asked me, during one of our Tuesday evening sessions, what had changed. And I remember pausing, not out of uncertainty, but out of the sheer weight of trying to find the words to explain the internal, tectonic shift that had occurred. I told her I didn't feel angry anymore, which surprised even me, because for so long my feelings about my family had been tangled in resentment, longing, shame, and guilt. But now it felt like I had stepped off a moving train and was finally standing still again. She nodded, not in approval, but in recognition, and said something I'll never forget. Sometimes the bravest thing you can do is stop showing up where you're not seen. The weeks rolled on, and I started to notice how much lighter I felt. Not euphoric, not magically healed, but lighter. I started sleeping through the night more often, not waking up with that racing heart or the sense of dread that something was about to crash down on me. I started taking walks again, not just as a way to escape my apartment, but because I genuinely wanted to feel the sun on my face. I stopped canceling plans with friends last minute because I was too exhausted to pretend I was okay. I even applied for a new job, something with more creative flexibility and less toxicity. And when I got the offer, I accepted it without once considering whether my parents would be impressed or disappointed. It wasn't their life anymore. It never had been. I had just convinced myself it was, because the idea of being truly alone felt scarier than the reality of being neglected. One afternoon, as I was organizing some paperwork, I came across a file labeled Family on my desktop. It was full of scanned medical forms, emergency contact information, travel itineraries, even old photos from past holidays where I had clearly gone out of my way to smile, to participate, to make everything look as seamless and happy as the captions my mother loved to write. I stared at the file for a long moment, then moved it to the trash. I didn't empty the trash right away. I left it there, a digital purgatory, just in case, but I never opened it again. The only moment of hesitation came late one evening, about a month into my silence, when I saw a missed call from my father. Just one ring, no voicemail, no follow-up text. And for a brief second, my heart twisted with that old reflex, the one that whispered, "What if something's wrong? What if they need you?" But I didn't call back. I sat with the discomfort, with the unfamiliar feeling of letting someone else sit in uncertainty for once. For my entire life, I had been the one to patch things up, to check in, to smooth the rough edges of everyone else's emotional messes. But not this time. Because what no one tells you is that the hardest part of building boundaries isn't setting them. It's sticking to them when the silence starts to feel like abandonment, even when you know it's a choice. It's refusing to answer the phone, not out of spite, but out of self-preservation. It's deleting the text before it's sent, even when you want to scream, "Why didn't you love me the way I needed you to?" I never got an answer to that question. I'm not sure I ever will. But what I was beginning to understand was that maybe the answer didn't matter as much as I once believed. Maybe the real power wasn't in forcing them to understand, but in finally fully choosing myself, quietly, without fanfare, and without asking permission. And maybe, just maybe, that was the kind of revenge they'd never see coming. The kind that wasn't loud or angry or destructive, but final. There comes a moment not marked by fireworks or some cinematic shift in lighting, but by a slow and steady clarity, when you realize that disappearing does not require a grand exit, no suitcase slamming shut or tearful monologues under the rain, no slammed doors or ultimatums thrown into the air like confetti. Sometimes, disappearing is nothing more than the quiet decision to stop participating, to stop volunteering yourself for a role in someone else's story, where you're not even listed in the credits. And that was the moment I had reached. Past the tears, past the disappointment, past even the dull ache of being constantly overlooked, and deep into the cold, sobering truth that I did not owe my family the courtesy of my continued availability, not after everything they had failed to see, hear, or offer over the years. There wasn't a singular trigger, no final straw, but a collection of small, stinging moments that piled so high I could no longer navigate around them. Like the time my mother posted a photo of the four of them, her, my father, Kelsey, and even the dog, at some backyard cookout with the caption, "All my heart in one photo," and my name wasn't even mentioned, let alone missed. Or the time I sent a card for my dad's birthday, handwritten, thoughtful, stamped and mailed a week in advance, and heard back nothing but a group text 2 days later, thanking everyone for all the love, with no mention of the card, no call, not even a thank you message. These weren't oversights. These were patterns. Patterns I had tried, for far too long, to interpret as mistakes, rather than what they really were, truths they had no intention of fixing. So I began the final phase. Not out of vengeance, not even out of anger, but out of sheer necessity. I started with the practical details, the parts of life that get overlooked when people talk about boundaries, but which are, in fact, the backbone of real change. I called my employer and updated my HR records, making sure that in the event of an emergency, it would be Claire they contacted, and not Donna or Martin Harper, who hadn't called me in over 6 weeks. I sat in the waiting room of my doctor's office, filled out a new form in neat, controlled handwriting, and scratched out my mother's name under next of kin. The woman behind the desk didn't ask why, and I appreciated that more than I could say. I combed through every part of my life that had been tied to them in name only. Bank accounts with my parents listed as backup contacts, apartment rental forms that still had their landline number, social media profiles where family tags created an illusion of connection, and I began severing ties one by one, not with malice, but with precision. Each change felt like removing a splinter, small, sharp, and long overdue. There was a strange satisfaction in the administrative nature of it all, like I was finally cleaning a room that had been gathering dust for years. I did not announce my absence at holidays. When Thanksgiving came, I simply didn't show up. I ignored the texts, left the phone on silent, baked a small tray of roasted vegetables, and sat at my table with a candle burning, not in mourning, but in quiet reclamation. The messages from my mother came later, short and clipped. "You okay?" followed by "It's not like you to go dark." I stared at those words, wondered how she could write them with a straight face, and then I let them sit in my inbox, unopened, unsent, unanswered. Christmas came next, and with it, the annual photo card that had once included me as a footnote in the corner, a blurry figure half hidden behind someone else's shoulder, my name written in cramped handwriting like an afterthought. This year's card didn't mention me at all. "The Harpers send love from home to yours," it said, signed by my mother, with 4 names beneath it. 4, not 5. The deliberate omission didn't sting the way I thought it would. It felt more like confirmation, a quiet acknowledgement that I was no longer expected, and therefore no longer bound to them by obligation. I had prepared myself for backlash, for some dramatic confrontation where my mother would call in fury, demanding explanations, casting herself as the victim of my cold behavior, perhaps even dragging Kelsey into the mix to mediate or manipulate or both. But the confrontation never came. What came instead was silence. Long, uninterrupted silence that echoed through the very places where I had once lived as their emotional fallback. And in that silence, I found the answer I hadn't known I was looking for. They didn't miss me. Not really. They missed the role I used to play, the predictability of my compliance, the comfort of knowing I would always pick up, always come through, always accept the scraps of love they rationed out whenever Kelsey wasn't occupying the spotlight. The absence of noise, the lack of a dramatic reckoning, was both a relief and a heartbreak. It meant I had made the right choice. It also meant there was never going to be a moment where they finally turned around and saw me standing there, arms outstretched, begging them to just understand. That moment, if it ever existed, had long passed. Claire noticed the change in me before I did. She said one evening while we were walking through the park that I seemed lighter, more focused, more like myself. I laughed, not because it was funny, but because it felt so strange to hear that I was returning to a self I had never really been allowed to fully become. We talked about nothing and everything, movies, memories, the way the light hit the trees just right in early winter. And I realized, somewhere between the idle steps and the shared silence, that I hadn't thought about my family in hours. Not with anger, not with sadness, just not at all. That night, as I curled into bed, I opened my phone and scrolled through old text messages, looking for some reason, any reason, to go back, to re-engage, to remind them that I still existed. But all I saw were conversations that felt one-sided, performative, shallow. Birthday reminders, logistics, occasional compliments laced with passive aggression. There was no substance, no weight, no recognition of who I really was. And so I closed the messages, turned off my phone, and placed it on the dresser, face down, silent, like the past I was finally done performing. They hadn't noticed my absence, not really. But someday I thought they might find themselves in need of information, of presence, of understanding. And when they reached for me in that moment, all they would find was the echo of their own choices. I wasn't punishing them. I was preserving myself. And maybe, just maybe, that was the most honest form of revenge, one that didn't demand retribution or confrontation. Just the simple, powerful act of no longer being available to people who only noticed me when I bled. It was a Monday afternoon when the call came. One of those bland, overcast days that feel like emotional gray noise, the kind that pass unnoticed unless something interrupts them. And I was standing in the kitchen with the window open, stirring a pot of soup I wasn't really hungry for, when my phone began to ring with a number I didn't recognize, area code unfamiliar, and my first instinct, trained over years of dodging spam, anxiety, and people I no longer owed anything to, was to ignore it. But some twitch of curiosity, or the faint pulse of dread that never entirely leaves once it's been trained into your nervous system, made me reach out and answer it, the ladle still in my other hand, the soup still bubbling behind me like a whisper I wasn't ready to hear. The voice on the other end was that kind of overly calm you only hear from funeral coordinators, hospital administrators, or those nice but distant women who called to confirm mammograms. She introduced herself as Sarah and said she was calling from New Grace Community Chapel, that she had been asked to contact me by name, that there had been a passing in the Harper family, and they thought I would want to know. My mouth opened, but no words came out. A passing. The word hung in the air like fog, and I wasn't sure whether it was supposed to float or suffocate me. I swallowed, asked, finally, when my voice returned, who it was, because even after everything, some small part of me feared it was my father, not because we were close, but because the idea of death, even his, still rang with a deep and ancient panic. But Sarah hesitated. She said it wasn't a direct family member, but a close family friend, someone named Alicia, and that the Harper family had asked her to inform extended family in case they wanted to attend the service. That's when it hit me. They didn't even know if I was family anymore. They were outsourcing the question. I thanked her with that default politeness you learn to deploy in conversations that confuse you, then ended the call and stood in the kitchen, phone still warm in my hand, listening to the soup hiss and spit on the stove. I hadn't thought about Alicia in years. One of Kelsey's oldest friends from college, the kind of girl who wore bracelets with charms that clinked and always seemed to smell faintly of coconut. She was harmless, friendly in that syrupy way that meant you were never quite sure if she liked you or was just programmed to perform sweetness. I remembered that she had moved to California, that she and Kelsey had traveled together once, maybe even to Bali. Yes, Bali, the trip they'd posted all those filtered photos from. The one my parents had funded while telling me therapy was indulgent. A thought occurred to me like a door swinging open slowly and then slamming shut all at once. Was this about that trip? Suddenly, I couldn't stay in the apartment anymore. I turned off the stove, poured the soup down the drain with a shaking hand, threw on a coat, and walked. I didn't know where I was going until I got there, feet carrying me on autopilot until I was standing in front of New Grace Community Chapel the next morning. The sky a dull slab of concrete above me, the kind that makes everything feel 10 pounds heavier. The parking lot was half full, the cars quiet, clean, orderly. I walked in and took a seat in the back, head low, not because I was hiding, but because I couldn't stand the idea of seeing them, any of them, before I had figured out what the hell I was doing there. The sanctuary smelled like artificial lilies and polished wood. Soft music played overhead, the kind designed to dull pain without curing it. And the photo slideshow had already begun on the screen at the front. Pictures of Alicia laughing in sunshine, holding drinks, climbing some scenic cliff with Kelsey by her side. They looked radiant, invincible, careless. I watched Kelsey's face flash across the screen in photo after photo, frozen in time, untouchable, while the voice of the pastor began to drone something about grace, about life lived boldly, about sudden loss and the illusion of control. It wasn't until after the service that I saw her, Kelsey, standing just outside the chapel doors with our parents on either side, her makeup perfectly applied, her grief photogenic. I stood still for a moment, debating whether to leave before they saw me, but my legs didn't move fast enough, and suddenly my mother was looking at me, eyes wide with something halfway between disbelief and hope, and then she was walking toward me with that overly tight expression she always wore when trying to act warm in public. "Leah," she said, as though it were a magic word, as though it should mean something, and for a moment I just looked at her, really looked, at the lines around her mouth that deepened every time she forced herself to care, at the way she clutched her purse like it might shield her from accountability, and then, when she reached for me, I stepped back. "We didn't know how to reach you," she said, a little breathless, her voice coated in performance. "It's been so long. You just disappeared." And I wanted, more than I can tell you, to scream that I hadn't disappeared at all, that I had waited and called and tried and been there until I wasn't anymore, that I had simply stopped offering pieces of myself to people who called it overreacting when I bled in front of them. But instead, I just said, "You knew exactly how," and walked past her, my footsteps echoing too loudly on the church tile. I didn't cry in the parking lot, or in the car, or even when I got home. I sat in the silence of my apartment, curled into a blanket, and stared at the wall like it might have answers I hadn't found in anyone else. Hours later, as the evening slipped into night, my phone buzzed once, just once, with a message from Kelsey. No hi, no hope you're well, no acknowledgement of the years that had passed, or the fact that we'd stood on opposite sides of a funeral with oceans between us. Just one sentence. "I used to be jealous of how calm you were. Now I just think you're cruel." I stared at it for a long time, longer than it deserved, trying to decide if I should respond, if I should explain to her that it wasn't cruelty that made me leave, but exhaustion, years of emotional smallness finally collapsing under the weight of its own neglect. But I didn't write anything. I didn't reply. I deleted the message, placed the phone back on the nightstand, and rolled onto my side, watching the shadows move across the ceiling like they knew secrets I had stopped asking for. People say you can't choose your family, but that's only partly true. You can't choose who raises you, who shares your name, or your blood, or your birthday dinners. But you can choose who gets to stay, who gets access to the version of you that is whole and healing and no longer begging to be acknowledged. And in that choice, there is more freedom than most of us ever dare to admit. I didn't stop loving them. I just stopped waiting for them to love me back. And maybe that's what they'll never forgive me for. Not the silence, not the distance, not even the absence, but the fact that, in the end, I left without asking them to understand why.